Acts like Remembrance Sunday are only shadows, echoes of a once unified culture that has now long since been shattered. It's one of the few examples that now all people in this country still unite around. They've lost their Christian heritage, they've lost their Christian identity. And they will not recover any sense of identity as being English until they rediscover their Christian roots. So what I would like to talk about is the connection between memory and media, and how Christians need to remember their corporate history. History is the thing that helps us to understand ourselves. It helps us to have a sense of our own identity and to know who we are as we go forward. Without knowing and remembering our history, a people lose their identity. And as Christians, we need to consider the history of the church and how the church travels and has travelled through time to the present as a way of understanding ourselves and understanding our own identity. Now, it's appropriate to be speaking about this topic today because today is Remembrance Sunday, and the British people are remembering the sacrifices of their fallen through each of the wars that they fought since 1914 to the present. And that is a part of their identity, this sense of the sacrifice that it cost to bring them forward, to the sacrifice that it cost to give them the freedoms that they currently enjoy. But as Christians, we also have an example of knowing our own history, of knowing our history through our own prism, through our own sense of identity. Paul speaks about this in Hebrews 11, and do read the whole chapter. In verse 13 we read, "All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." As Christians, our sense of history is not rooted in any nation state. I'm not British. As Christians, you're not American or Canadian or Australian. You're not Japanese or Nigerian. You're not from Zimbabwe or South African. You're not Russian or Polish. As Christians, we form a nation of our own. And we have a history of our own. We aren't people that belong to any worldly kingdom. But we are, as it were, strangers in a foreign land. We are, as it were, a community of travellers, pilgrims, moving through the centuries until the completion of history. As implied in this, we look back to the champions of faith that Paul speaks upon. He speaks about the champions of faith in Hebrews 11 to give us examples of what faith can achieve, of what faith can accomplish. But in so doing, he creates this secondary level of teaching, that we should remember our history. And so as Christians, it's incumbent upon all of us to remember the history of the church, the first account of which was written in the book of Acts, a second account of which was written by Eusebius, and then after that there are many historians of the church. So for example, I believe it was St. Anselm who wrote a history of the church in England, a history of the Christian people in England. We as Christians have a rich heritage that goes back 2,000 years from the time of the apostles to the present. And it is a history that reflects in many ways this next part of the passage of Hebrews 11 that I'm about to read. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David and Samuel and the prophets, and who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains, and caves and holes in the ground. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. And so it is, brothers, we have to speak of the fact that the church continues that story of being champions of faith. We have put to flight the armies of the enemies of Christ. We have suffered torturings. We have suffered deprivations. We have performed miracles. As Christians, if we don't remember our history, we will forget our identity. And I would like to pull out 4 lessons that I think are important that Christians need to remember from their own history in the maintenance of their identity. 1, the church did not advance by being a pacifistic organization. 2, the church defended its orthodoxy, its doctrine, its way of worship. 3, the church stood by its own sense of values and identity, even against the state. 4, the church was always at its weakest when it was divided against itself. Now, there are many, many other lessons that can be drawn from Christian history. But these 4, I think, are the most important that we need to remember today. The media, with its liberal agenda, is seeking to remove the idea of cultural identity from society. It is seeking to dilute the sense of identity that people have to create a pluralistic, multicultural, by the liberal concept, society in which personal identity rooted in a historical identity is diluted to the point that it does not exist. The English of this land have already suffered terribly under this kind of indoctrination. They've lost their sense of identity. They are now all individuals so individual that they have no common identity upon which to unite around. Acts like Remembrance Sunday are only shadows, echoes of a once unified culture that has now long since been shattered. It's one of the few examples that now all people in this country still unite around. They've lost their Christian heritage, they've lost their Christian identity. And they will not recover any sense of identity as being English until they rediscover their Christian roots and their Christian history. But as Christians, regardless of what the English do, we as Christians must remember the history of the church. We must remember what the church has gone through. We must remember, for instance, that the church has faced heresies before, and it faced them directly on. We must remember that the church contended for its unity. We must remember that the church has often in its history been on the back foot, has been on the retreat. It hasn't always been the dominant religion, but through faith it has overcome the heretics. It has overcome division. It has overcome the oppression of Viking pagans, of Roman pagans. It overcame the oppression of the Islamic jihads that were fought against the Christian church right through the 1400 years of Islamic history, 3 times defeating the jihad against Europe. Ethiopia, the only Christian country, not only to resist the occupations of the Islamic world, but also the attempts of colonialism. It is from our Christian history that we will draw strength as Christians. And it is from our Christian history that many of those countries that are now weak, emasculated and enfeebled will recover their strength as they recover their Christian identity. And it is only when we reclaim our Christian identity and take confidence in it, learning from where we've gone wrong and learning from where we have succeeded, that we as Christians, the church, will go from being on the retreat to reclaiming ground for Christ and his kingdom.